Wifredo Lamb talks about his work as a mental decolonization. He says that he wants to act like a Trojan horse. There's certainly no overt propaganda here. We don't see the struggle against colonialism, which is beginning to go on all around the world, at the very point at which he's painting works like this. These paintings appear to be big, ambitious works of a European avant-garde painter. But the content, that's something else again. A Guernica-like, disturbing, dark vision, a dream vision, almost. One of the first black artists to become famous on the almost exclusively white art scene of the 1940s and 1950s was Wifredo Lamb. As European empires around the globe crumbled, Lamb claimed a high purpose for his work, to disturb the dreams of the exploiters. His paintings offered a strange, dizzying mix of the European avant-garde and an emergent, anti-colonial black culture. Wifredo Lamb was an extraordinary figure in many ways. He was born in Cuba, has a middle-class upbringing, underwent academic training in painting there, and then, like many of his compatriots with those interests, he went off to Europe to study in depth European art. He went to Spain first, underwent terrible personal tragedy when his wife and his only child died of tuberculosis. For quite a while, he couldn't paint and spent his time reading. He was someone of immense intellectual culture, in fact. Lamb is in many ways radicalized by the Spanish Civil War. He starts to take a serious interest in Marxism. He also fought and was wounded. Lamb was connecting the history of his people, the Cuban people, the slave trade, of all the depredations of colonialism to the Spanish situation. Lamb becomes quite close to Picasso, and Picasso takes a great interest in Lamb. Picasso, of course, has been using African motifs in his art, particularly masks of sub-Saharan Africa, for really a long time. Lamb seizes on that in certain ways and begins to turn it towards his own purposes. These so-called primitive elements are something that Lamb very consciously moves towards and discovers, first in Europe, in fact. There were milieux within Paris where it was quite comfortable to be black, especially if you were on the artistic scene. And Cuba came as a huge shock to Lamb, because there all the old racial and colonial hierarchies were still very firmly in place, and his black skin meant a lot. Lamb, in reconnecting with black culture, became very interested in Santeria, which is a syncretic religion mixing African and Catholic strands and producing this remarkable hybrid. Lamb is not exactly a believer in Santeria, but he is extremely interested in this culture as an expression of black experience, of what happens to black people once they're uprooted from many different places in Africa and thrown together on these plantations. How do they begin to recreate a culture to which they can all relate? In this painting, Lamb is loading avant-garde European forms and techniques with elements from Santeria. The horse form, for instance, relates to the Santeria idea that when people are possessed by a spirit in Santeria rituals, it is as if the spirit is riding the human like a horse. Also, there's this idea of the god of the crossroads, a guardian to another world. So there's a sense in which this painting, with its strange forms, is opening up the imagination, freeing the spirit, giving you access to a world which is far beyond the rational calculations of the exploiters. Someone who's very important to Lamb at this time is Aimé Césaire, and he writes this rather extraordinary poem, Return to a Native Land. Lamb actually illustrates an edition of this book. Lamb and Aimé Césaire are trying to construct a culture of blackness which takes in the idea that these people have been uprooted from all sorts of different cultures, thrown together, oppressed, made to labor, but made to come together too. So how to take that history of oppression and to begin to turn it into something positive, to say, look at what we have created here culturally. There is an idea, says Lamb, of the jungle in many of his works, including this one. But it's not a real jungle. This is very important. It's a psychological place, says Lamb, somewhere where the imagination and the spirit can run free, where the surrealist marvelous, too, perhaps, is in operation. And this jungle, the actual place that Lamb shows us here, far from being a jungle, in fact, is a plantation. We see sugar canes very clearly in the background to this painting. And that, of course, immediately relates to very harsh labor and racialized labor that is still going on in Cuba at this time. The strangeness of Lamb's paintings come out of the idea that he is taking a culture which, for most European and American and Caribbean whites, is despised. It's the lowest of the low. It's something that which they would never normally contemplate or think about. And he allies it with the heights of the European avant-garde, starts to paint it in large paintings, oil on canvas, puts it in gilt frames, and brings it into the gallery and then eventually into the museum. So this is an extraordinary thing to do. I think in looking at a painting like this, if one of Lamb's exploiters was to do so, they would see a vision of a diasporic black culture, one which is violent, which is free and imaginative, in which all hierarchies are overturned, in which you can look at no one particular form and say, this is this, the idea of a secure, superior European civilization is overturned in a vision like this. And indeed, one might even think of some plantation owner lying awake at night, having been disturbed by a nightmare such as this. On the left, you have a figure who has been identified with Venus, goddess of love, but also, as you can see, is one of these hybrid god riding a human. On the right, there's a god of war, both Ares, but also a god of Santeria, a very aggressive black form with these spiky, violent elements. And in the background, the figure of Belial or Mephistopheles with his tail and his horns. As with Guernica, to which it quite closely relates, as does a lot of Lamb's work at this time, and he comes into a very self-conscious dialogue with Picasso and his work. This is a very dark work about exploitation and violence.
André Breton was a remarkable polymathic figure, a theoretician and poet.
He becomes very interested in Lamb and remains so. And it's not surprising, because Lamb is offering a deep form of surrealism in practice. The overturning of hierarchies, the liberating of imagination, of a racial revolution, in a sense. In Europe, and indeed in Cuba, there was a culture of exoticism in which the so-called primitive gets simplified, sold. Lamb says that he doesn't want to have anything to do with this selling of primitivism. He wants nothing to do with the cha-cha-cha, as he puts it. At the same time, I think that Lamb believes that there is a black culture of an essential kind, which he, as a black person, can tap into. And he says something like that. He says, somehow I seem to be coming up with these forms of Santeria, but they're just coming out of my own consciousness. There's a way in which Lamb plays to his blackness and to his Africanness. If you think about the terms in which Lamb's art is described, particularly as it first emerges onto the art scene, it's always in terms of magic and mysticism and savagery and primitivism and all our dark atavistic urges. So there's this conservative hierarchy is still in place, in a sense, which allows Lamb to be consumed. And Lamb himself does say, for a long time I think my work won't be really understood. So he's, I think, aware of the danger that it may just get read again as a piece of consumable black culture, another piece of cha-cha-cha.